A final goodbye for the nation's 39th president, the commander-in-chief, Jimmy Carter, who served in the White House from 1977 to 1981. He died at the age of 100 on December 29th. Today, Washington honors him one last time at a service at the National Cathedral here in the nation's capital, with all 5 of the nation's living presidents attending. President Biden also delivering remarks. President Biden was serving in his first term in the Senate during the Carter administration. Outside of the cathedral, there will be another small ceremony. Military that will continue with their honors to their commander-in-chief outside of the National Cathedral before a motorcade takes the late president and his family to Joint Base Andrews, where then, for the final time, he will lift off from Washington to make it home to Plains, Georgia, where he will be buried at his home next to his beloved wife, Rosalynn Carter. President from Plains, Georgia, is on his way home, leaving Washington one last time. Current and former presidents gathering at the nation's National Cathedral, along with first ladies and vice presidents, members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, all paying their respects today here in the nation's capital for the 39th president of the United States. It's been 6 days of tributes for the 39th president, Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer from Georgia, who became president of the United States. Joining us is Lindsay Chervinsky. She's the executive director of George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Lindsay Chervinsky, what stood out to you from this service at the National Cathedral today?
I think there are a couple of things that really caught my eye. The first was that the eulogies demonstrated Carter's appeal to people from multiple sides of the aisle and also to people who the presidents don't always necessarily get along with. So he had two eulogies that were delivered by his former presidential opponent in a presidential election and his vice president. And as we have seen in the last couple of decades, the vice presidential relationship can be a challenging one. It's really tricky. And Carter and Mondale were actually instrumental in setting the tone for what it meant to have a productive relationship. So that was, I think, the first thing that stuck out to me. The second thing was the building itself was really filled with 20th century American history. It was filled with presidents and former presidents and first ladies and their families and people who've worked in policy. And so it was, as a historian, really fun to see that huge span of history in one building.
How did it become customary, it seems, that you have these state funerals in the nation's capital and that there is this service at the National Cathedral? Why the National Cathedral?
Well, in 1893, Congress basically decided there should be a spot for there to be a national mourning location, for there to be some sort of cathedral place, some spot where this type of service, some type of prayer or worship could be held. Construction of this building didn't actually start until 1907, but as early as Woodrow Wilson's passing in 1924, there started to be services on the grounds of this space. And not always the funerals. The funeral of Wilson was at his home. The funeral of FDR was in the White House. But there was a recognition that you wanted to have an opportunity for the country to mourn. And the National Cathedral is, I think, designed to embody that for all people.
And is that the point of a state funeral as well? Is that the country as one mourns the passing of a former president?
I believe so. I think it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In particular, I think there's a recognition that even if the president is no longer in office, they were the former head of state. And so it makes sense to have some sort of service for them in the nation's capital on behalf of the American people, in recognition that even if they don't currently hold those powers, they did at one time. And that is a tremendous burden and service and sacrifice.
We spoke the other day when the former president, the late president, came to Washington for the final time, and you spoke about these state funerals. Who gets to decide? Who plans them? Remind our viewers.
Absolutely. So every single element of these funerals, of the commemorations that we've seen over the last 6 days, sometimes it's 8 days. Reagan had 8 days, and actually Carter had planned for 8 days, but because of where the New Year's Day holiday fell, they had to shorten it. They start that planning process almost the moment they go into the White House, because what they learned with John F. Kennedy is you don't want to have a president die suddenly and have no plan. And so you start that plan in the White House, and then once they leave, they update it, they evolve as they take on new passions and interests, then their family expands and grows, and they pick every song, every person in attendance, every speaker, every single detail is decided by the president and their family.
The presidential hearse is leaving the National Cathedral right now. It will be a 40-minute, estimated drive to Joint Base Andrews, where then the casket carrying the late president will aboard Air Force One. But today its call sign is Special Air Mission 39. When the president's not aboard, the call sign is Special Air Mission 39, added today to mark our 39th president. We'll continue to watch as the motorcade takes the late president and his family to the Air Force Base. Joining us is Lindsay Chervinsky. She's the executive director at George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. We're talking about the customs here. What else is customary about the tributes that we have seen over the last few days?
Well, a lot of the customs that we've seen have actually really evolved only since Ronald Reagan's funeral. He was the first president to have a televised funeral. This was the age of television when every single step could be covered and filmed. Prior to that, a lot of the services tended to be a little bit more modest, even if they did have a state funeral. It's very customary for them to have two funerals, one here like we've seen in DC, one at their final resting place. In terms of Carter, we've actually seen three ceremonies. We saw Georgia, DC, and then back to Georgia again. Some other elements that I think usually play a role, the military is usually involved in some way. The military in the military district of Washington, D.C. is in charge of overseeing the security and all of the logistics of the moving pieces. But if a president has a special connection to a particular branch, like we've seen with Carter in the Navy, they might choose to honor that through music or through a symbolic presence. If they have a particular, business interest, or if they have something in their past they want to highlight, peanuts have been discussed a lot in the last couple of days, we might see something like that. And then, of course, usually their family, their close friends, and people who were important to them when they were in the White House. So we usually do see some sort of advisor or official that understood them or can speak to who they really were and what mattered to them.
Let's go back to the National Cathedral and the service there. Who is invited, and do you have to be invited to be part of the service that we saw earlier?
You do, and this sounds like a strange thing to say, but those invitations are actually quite hot commodities. It is one of those events in DC where if you are involved in that space, you often want to be seen, and you want to see the people who are there. So there's a lot of clamoring over who gets to go to what service. Some of that, of course, is that people just want to pay respects and they want to be a part of that memory. And so there's usually decision within the family about who to invite to which place, who to include. There are usually heads of state that are represented, different branches of government, former officials, family members, friends, but there are never enough seats for the number of people who want to attend. And so there sometimes ends up being difficult choices or even last minute juggling if people have to pull out at the last minute. So there's a lot of behind the scenes logistics happening over the last couple days.
And as we watch this motorcade, I want to read for our viewers what Politico had to say. Carter will accomplish what perhaps no other president could do at this moment, bringing together all 5 living current and former presidents, 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats. We saw that scene unfold before the service took place. Is it customary for a former president and first lady, vice presidents to attend these services?
It is. We talk a lot about the President's Club, and then we're often referring to them while they're alive and activities that they partake in to support one another. Usually there's a visit to the White House. We see those photographs. There's talk about the advice that they can give to one another because so few people understand what it actually means to be in that position. But they also do all typically gather when one of their members passes away, and we've seen that over the last several decades. That doesn't mean it's always a particularly friendly club. I think any observer who watched the body language could see that some people were more excited to see others, and who did and did not speak to whom. But I think the power of that club, the power of the precedent of showing up, and the power of the institution and recognizing the institution, the fact that it can still force all of them into one room, says an awful lot.
And USA Today reported that the president told them in an interview on Sunday, that's President Biden, that he promised Carter he'd deliver his eulogy in 2021. You heard the president during his remarks talk about that visit that he had made to Jimmy Carter and his wife back in 2021. Here's a quote. "I bent down. He was in tough shape. To kiss him goodbye, and he asked me to do his eulogy," he said, of that final conversation the two had, which marked Biden's 100th day in office at that time. Is that customary, that the current president would deliver these remarks?
It is often customary for a current president to deliver a eulogy, especially if they had a somewhat decent relationship. You know, George W. Bush delivered Reagan's eulogy. What was interesting about that particular state funeral is both he and his father delivered eulogies, because Bush 41 was, of course, Reagan's vice president. And the difference between them was interesting, because Bush 41 talked about their personal anecdotes, their personal relationship, some of the funnier stories about Reagan. And then the current president at that time, President George W. Bush, gave more of the biographical approach. And so it is customary, as long as I think the relationship is somewhat pleasant.
Let's talk about the age that Jimmy Carter lived to, 100 years old, the longest living president. What if, and as we watch the President's Club come together today, what if these others were to live, or other presidents were to have lived to 100 years old?
Yeah, you know, I think it's interesting because we've had an interesting tradition in American history where typically presidents don't have that long of post-presidential lives. Now, partly that was because modern medicine is a relatively new invention, and death used to be much less predictable in the 19th century than it is today. But then we did see this period of time where we had younger presidents. And so I wish that I could remember which article I was reading this morning, but there was a great series of statistics about what would have happened if former presidents had as long of a post-presidential life as Carter did. Now, sometimes that's not possible because if they're older in office, but you know, if we think about Lincoln, if Lincoln had had as long of a post-presidential life, then he would have died in 1909. And if Theodore Roosevelt had had as long as a post-presidential life, then he would have lived to see the advent of nuclear weapons. My particular favorite is if Kennedy had died, or excuse me, if Kennedy had had as long of a post-presidential life, he would have died in 2017. So it just kind of makes you think about all of the history that Carter has witnessed and the time that he was able to contribute to making the world a better place.
Yeah, President Biden said he led on civil rights. He was a hard-working farmer, a president who redefined the relationship with a vice president. Interesting, coming from Joe Biden, who served as vice president and now as president.
Yeah, you know, and at times it has seemed like Biden and Obama have been very close. They appeared to be very close when they were in office. There were all of those great bromance memes that went viral on the internet. As you know, the history has come out, there have been stories about there being more tension than perhaps were always, you know, front and center or met the eye. And then since then, I think there have been some rocky waters in that relationship. And certainly we've seen similar reporting with Kamala Harris and President Biden. You know, I think it's really hard to have a good relationship between those two offices. The vice presidency is really weird. It doesn't really have constitutional responsibilities. It entirely depends on the president. Their job is to be supportive, but clearly they're just kind of waiting around. So it doesn't exactly set up for easy friendships.
Interesting then, as you said, that the son of Vice President Mondale gave those remarks today and talked about the relationship that the two of them had.
Yeah, and clearly a very warm relationship and a good relationship, and one that meant a great deal to Carter. Otherwise, I don't think he would have singled Mondale out for that honor.
President Biden also said that Jimmy Carter was a model of post-presidency. What did you make of that?
Well, he was. You know, in some ways, he was a model for a new type of post-president, because prior to Carter, most former presidents went home. They were relatively quiet. They didn't really particularly participate in politics, but they also didn't have a whole lot of public presence. And Carter was young and he wanted something to do with his time, and so he created the Carter Center. And now most presidents have centers that are not just affiliated with their libraries, but also have a philanthropic element to them. They usually have missions, whether it's democracy or medicine or health or human rights, but Carter did all of those things. And so he really, I think, carved a new path for what was possible for former presidents to consider with their time, influence, and power.
His grandson, in his eulogy, marking the noting the Presidential Carter Center has 3,500 employees, only about 100 here in America, and the rest across the world.
It's really incredible. You know, and I think Carter was clearly very focused on global affairs. That was true during his presidency, and I think some of his biggest contributions were with foreign policy. but I attribute that a lot to his time in the Navy. He lived all over the place. He got to see a lot of new types of people. And I also attribute it to his Christian faith. I think there is an element of wanting to lift up those that are struggling the most. And he often found spaces like the guinea worm or river blindness where he could make a real, tangible impact on millions of lives.
Jimmy Carter, the late president, is on his way home to Plains, Georgia right now. The motorcade on your screen just is still inside Washington, actually under the Kennedy Center, right now, making its way to the Beltway and then to Joint Base Andrews. From there, there will be another ceremony. The military will honor the commander-in-chief there with more Hail to the Chief, 21-gun salute, before the casket is put on Air Force One. Today, as we said, called Special Air Mission 39. The Carter family will also board there, and they will go to Plains, Georgia, back home. The late president will be buried at his home in Plains, Georgia, next to his wife, Rosalynn Carter, who died over a year ago. Being buried at, this is his preference, being buried at his home, his wife buried there as well. Talk about their home in Plains, Georgia. Is it a public site?
It is now, yes. It has been taken over by the National Park Service. This was the Carter's decision and the Carter's wish. It is not uncommon for presidents to do so once they are no longer living at a particular place, in recognition that this was where they were formed, this is where their story began. Often they will have a presidential library or a museum that accompanies that site. So a good example of this is the Eisenhower Museum in Abilene, Kansas. There's the childhood home of Eisenhower right next to the museum and the presidential library, and that is a National Park Service site as well. So it is not unusual for that to happen. What I think is amazing about Carter's decision to go home is he's not being buried at the presidential library. He's being buried at his home with Rosalynn, and that is a slightly more unusual choice.
The home built in 1961, and you heard his grandson talk about it, a very modest home, ranch style, pictures all over the refrigerator. What did you make of the description his grandson had of his grandpa?
Well, it's not what we typically associate with presidential homes, to be sure. Not that all presidents have been wealthy, but usually once they leave office, they do write books, they give talks, they end up living in slightly different circumstances, perhaps, than when they came into office. And the commitment, to me, what it signifies is a commitment to the community and a commitment to the church community and the people and the neighbors that he grew up with, and a recognition of how much his presence could continue to do for Georgia. He didn't have to go back there, and he chose to. And so for me, it's a little bit less about the house and more about the roots and wanting to make sure that as long as he was able to, he gave back to that space.
When he left office, he discovered that his family farm was in debt. I mean, he was, I believe, $1 million in debt. They did have to make money.
They did, yes. And the way that he chose to do so was writing books. He didn't want to necessarily give a lot of expensive speeches, because even though he certainly could have, because I think he worried that it would somehow shift either his preferences or it would make him seem biased towards a certain group. But if he wrote books and he was paid for his words, then he felt like that was a more honest living. So he wrote more books than any other former president. I think it's something like 32. 32. Which, as someone who's written books, wow, that makes me feel like a slacker. I'm nowhere near that number. It's really quite impressive. And it's on all different subjects. He took his hand to poetry. He, wrote about foreign policy. He wrote about his life, and I think that's an incredible way to spend one's time.
And he was honored for his post-presidency work with the Nobel Peace Prize.
He was. I mean, it's if you were to add all these things up, you almost feel like you would be making it up, because how could anyone possibly fit all of these things into their life? But his work in foreign policy in particular, and trying to continue diplomacy, especially in the Middle East, but also they did a lot of work with democracy and election monitoring. They would go and they would serve as election monitors that were not involved in any of the political process, such that they could be honest brokers. That's a really incredible way to contribute to the spread of democratic ideals.
And then his dedication and commitment to public health. He was quoted as saying he wanted to make sure that he was alive long enough to see the end of the guinea worm. His grandson talking about the devastation of that disease in Africa, going from millions of cases to 14.
It's unbelievable. What I think is remarkable about that particular choice is it's not necessarily a disease that a lot of people would know about in the United States. It's not necessarily the sexiest of cures to try and come up with, but he understood it as something that he could make a tangible difference. That if he put the weight of the Carter Center, the funds and the power and the research behind it, then they could actually really move the needle. And that's a remarkable thing to do.
I also want to read from Politico magazine, and again, the motorcade on your screen today is the motorcade that is bringing the late president and his family to Joint Base Andrews. Another ceremony will follow there. Before then, Special Air Mission 39 takes off for the final time from Washington and brings the president home to Plains, Georgia. There will be services there as well. Marks 6 days of tributes to the commander-in-chief. Politico magazine, son of the South is what they write, a farmer, a Southern Baptist, and a native of South Georgia with the accent to match. Carter was unambiguously of the Deep South. With his open hand to black voters, though, he was not a reminder of the bad old days. And in 1976, the images from Little Rock, Oxford, Tuscaloosa, Philadelphia, Selma, and Memphis were all fresh memories, closer than what 9/11 is to today. He was a beneficiary of exquisite timing as well. By running 11 years after the Voting Rights Act, he was able to win over millions of enfranchised Southern black people while still retaining the votes of Southern whites who remained loyal to their ancestral party, many of them having come of age when Franklin D. Roosevelt was as popular there as air conditioning.
I was listening to some commentary this morning, and when I was looking at the political map, Jimmy Carter won the South in terms of the electoral map the exact same way that Donald Trump did this year, or this past year, I should say. The only Southern state he didn't win was Virginia. The only Southern state that Trump didn't win was Virginia. And I think that demonstrates what you're talking about in terms of the shift of the electorate from both the civil rights era and then up through today. But Carter was absolutely shaped by his formative experiences in the South. He grew up in a deeply segregated town. His father was a segregationist. He also had, at the same time, a black nanny or a black housekeeper who was a central figure in his life. And when he gave interviews about her, I think even into his 90s, he would tear up because of how special she was to him. And so, he did have to, especially in his second gubernatorial campaign, he did kind of have to play footsie a little bit with some of the segregationist ideas. He kind of towed the line with some of that. But then the minute he was elected, he said the time for segregation is over, and he never looked back. He had the support of people like Martin Luther King Sr., and he brought those same ideas to Washington and appointed more people of color to the federal judiciary than I believe any president prior combined.
What also shaped him was his faith, and we heard about that today. And here we are on this January 9th, just days away from our next inauguration of the 47th president. Washington Post. For Jimmy Carter, faith was inseparable from politics and life. In his inaugural address in January 1977, Jimmy Carter spoke just 4 sentences before quoting from Scripture.
I will go out on a limb and I will say that I don't think we're going to see that in a week and a half. Carter is probably the most religious former president we have had. It was certainly central to his presidency. It's not to say that all presidents have to be that way, but I think that he didn't always like politics. He saw it as a means to an end, and he was deeply driven by his faith to try and make the world a better place, and politics was a very useful way to do that. So sometimes his frustration with other politicians, his unwillingness to participate in sort of the DC culture reflected that distaste, while ultimately still wanting the power to try and actually do something with it.
One lighthearted moment from today's eulogies was when one of those speakers said that God should be ready for Jimmy Carter to let him know how heaven can be a more harmonious place.
Yeah, there were some really good there were some really funny moments today, and I'm glad people brought that humor, because I do think these are, of course, somber events, but they should be human events too. So I really appreciated that his grandson Jason talked about the time that he called him and thought he was taking a picture and didn't know how to use his telephone despite being a nuclear engineer. So that was probably also one of my favorite moments.
What about, though, the separation of church and state? You know, and faith is, and religion is always brought into services that we see like this. Not just Jimmy Carter's. He was devout Christian, but we've seen it in other services for former presidents.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, the National Cathedral is, I believe, under the Episcopalian umbrella, if I'm remembering correctly, but this service is considered to be non-denominational. Of course, it's Christian, but it is non-denominational because it has representatives from a lot of different Christian traditions and backgrounds. And yet, you raise, I think, a valuable point, which is that we do have a very strict separation in our Constitution and in the First Amendment that the church and the state are not necessarily supposed to combine. Now, they can individually for someone's preferences, and I think in this case it was a particularly religious service because Carter was so religious himself. But I think that you raise a good question, that these are things we should be thinking about. What is the appropriate level of religion in commemoration? What is the appropriate level of religion in the presidency? I suspect every single person would have a different answer to that question, but I do think they're questions worth discussing.
As we said, the motorcade is underway over to Joint Base Andrews, and from there, the late president will go home to Plains, Georgia, along with the Carter family, the 4 children that he and Rosalind had, and as well as the many, almost a couple dozen grandchildren and great-grandchildren, many of them attending today. The honor guard, the special honor guard you can see on your right at Joint Base Andrews, they're marching into place. There will be more tributes and honors given to the former commander-in-chief, Lindsay Chervinsky. Why do we do things like 4 flourishes and ruffles and hail to the chief and a 21-gun salute? What is the significance?
Well, I think it's a dual significance. One, it's in honor of Jimmy Carter's personal military service. If anyone has attended a funeral for someone who has served in the military, typically there's a military element towards the end. There's a salute, there's a flag presented. That's pretty common. But also in recognition that he was commander-in-chief and he was commander of the military. He obviously was no longer in that position, but as a former commander, receives the honors due to a commander at his passing.
21-gun salute, the significance of that in particular.
Wow, that stumps me. I should know that.
No, it's okay. It's all right. There's a lot of details.
There's a lot of details.
And that is actually an interesting point, because the military, as you were talking about, oversees this, the Joint Task Force for the Capital Region that oversees this entire funeral. How do they quickly get all of the resources that we have seen on our screens over the past 6 days, quickly put everybody in place? Do they practice, or how is it that they pull this off?
Yeah, they do. So there is because this is so well planned, they have a really good sense of what is supposed to happen at any given moment, how it's supposed to happen, who is supposed to be involved, where those resources are supposed to come from. And then, of course, as a former president fails, if it seems like it is somewhat predictable, and thankfully Carter had such a long and glorious life that it was sort of predictable towards the end, they are usually given a heads up as things are starting to look like the moment might be nearing. But because it is well planned, there are always funds set aside. There are the military district is ready to go. That doesn't mean there's not last minute scrambling. There always is, to pull in people, especially around the holidays. I'm sure a lot of people were on leave, and some of that leave was canceled. But there is a pretty good plan in place.
All right. Well, the motorcade has now just entered into Maryland, and we are just moments away from the presidential hearse making its way onto Joint Base Andrews. The military honors will continue. We've been talking with Lindsay Chervinsky. She's the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. When this is all over, Lindsay Chervinsky, what are the lessons learned? What does history say about a week like this?
I think there are a couple things we can take away from it. So the first is that legacies take a long time to unfold. If Carter had died a couple weeks after leaving office, we would be having very different conversations than we're having today. And that's partly because a lot of the policies he put in place hadn't yet unfolded. We didn't know how they were going to work, or if they were going to work, or if his diplomatic efforts would pan out. So, history takes a long time to really understand exactly what people's roles in it are. The second, I think people will come away with an appreciation that much of what we celebrate Carter for is not political. It's above politics. His decency, his goodness, his humanitarian commitment, his service, those are not political things. And that is something worth remembering, that there are things that are not political. The last piece, and I would encourage everyone to think about, we have seen all of these ceremonies, and regardless of how you feel about the president, sometimes they look an awful lot like the ceremonies that we have seen across the pond for monarchs, for kings and queens. And there is a question about whether or not we actually want to do that, and what is the right way to celebrate a former president who is just a citizen like everyone else in a republic.
There is a cost to this as well. We've seen it range greatly for former presidents. And who foots the bill for
our coverage of the state funeral for the late President Jimmy Carter continues on C-SPAN 3 and on the C-SPAN Now video app. We're going to break away to fulfill our 45-year commitment to live gavel-to-gavel coverage of the U.S. Senate, considering a bill today that would direct DHS to detain migrants for theft-related crimes. Live Senate coverage right here on C-SPAN 2.